There are betrayals that break your heart, and then there are betrayals that shatter your sense of reality. This is the story of how, while I was sitting beside my dying father and carrying my unborn child, the person I trusted most. I did not see it coming. I did not imagine it was possible. And when the truth finally surfaced, it rewrote everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and survival. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Voices of Kaitlyn Grit. My name is Kaitlyn Grit, and today I am bringing you a story that will leave you speechless. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a story like this. And if you enjoy dramatic, real-life betrayals, hit that like button now. It helps the channel grow. Now, let us dive in. My name is Tracy McCormick, and for 12 years, I believed I was living a life many people only dreamed of. I was married to my husband, Lynn McCormick, a man I thought I knew down to his smallest habits. We had two beautiful children together, our 10-year-old son, Mason, who had my stubborn streak and Lynn's quiet thoughtfulness, and our 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, whose laughter filled every corner of our home. At the time this story begins, I was also pregnant with our third child, a pregnancy that felt like a promise of new beginnings layered gently over an already full life. We lived in a comfortable home, not extravagant, but warm and familiar, the kind of house where shoes piled up by the door and school art projects decorated the refrigerator. Our mornings were rushed and chaotic, our evenings noisy and imperfect, and yet I felt grounded. I felt chosen. I felt safe. Lynn and I had built our marriage slowly, deliberately. We met in our early 20s, married after 4 years, and spent over a decade learning how to be partners. We argued like any couple did, but we also laughed easily. We shared responsibilities, made plans for the future, and supported each other through setbacks. Or at least that is what I believed. If there was one constant thread woven through my life since childhood, it was my best friend, Diana Whitaker. Diana and I had been inseparable since we were little girls. We grew up on the same street, shared secrets under blankets, and promised each other that no matter what happened, we would always be family. She stood beside me on my wedding day. She held my hands during my first labor. She knew my fears, my weaknesses, and the history of my heart. Diana was not just my best friend, she was my chosen sister. Then my father got sick. My father, Richard Ellison, was the quiet strength in my life. He was steady, patient, and endlessly kind. When I was a child, he was the one who showed up to every school event, even the ones that barely lasted 10 minutes. When I became an adult, he was the one who answered his phone no matter how late it was. He had always been there, and I never imagined a world where he would not be. The diagnosis came like a blunt force to the chest: terminal cancer, advanced, aggressive. The doctor spoke gently, carefully, as if softer words might soften the reality. They did not. We were given months, not years. Time suddenly became the most fragile thing I had ever held. From that moment on, my life shifted. I spent long days and longer nights at the hospital, sitting beside my father's bed, holding his hand, memorizing the sound of his breathing. The sterile smell of antiseptic became familiar. The beeping of machines became background noise to whispered conversations and quiet prayers. I talked to him about everything and nothing, about my children, about the baby growing inside me, about memories from my childhood that I did not want to forget. Lynn seemed supportive at first. He told me to take all the time I needed. He handled dinners, helped with homework, tucked the kids into bed when I could not be there. Diana stepped in too, offering rides, watching the kids, bringing meals to the hospital. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be surrounded by such love during the hardest season of my life. I did not know that this was the moment everything began to unravel. Grief does something strange to your perception of time. Days blur together, moments stretch and collapse all at once. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. Pregnancy had already drained me, and now grief layered itself on top, heavy and unrelenting. I trusted the people around me because I did not have the energy to question them. Diana was everywhere. She picked Mason up from soccer practice. She braided Sophia's hair for school. She sat with Lynn in our kitchen late into the evening, talking in low voices when I came home from the hospital, too tired to do more than shower and sleep. I told myself that this was what support looked like. This was what community did when someone was hurting. Lynn began to change in ways that were subtle enough to ignore if you wanted to. He hugged me, but his embrace felt distracted. He asked about my father, but his eyes wandered. He told me he was proud of me for how strong I was, yet there was a distance in his voice that I couldn't quite name. I told myself that he was coping in his own way, that this was stress, that men process grief differently. There were nights when I came home after midnight, emotionally wrung out, and found the house quiet, too quiet. The kids asleep, lights off, Lynn already in bed. Other nights he wasn't there at all. He said work had been demanding, projects had deadlines, emergencies came up. Diana always had an explanation ready. She laughed it off, told me Lynn was working hard to keep things stable while I focused on my father. She reminded me how lucky I was to have such a devoted husband. I wanted to believe her. Looking back, there were moments that should have stopped me cold. Lynn started keeping his phone face down on the table. He stepped out of the room to take calls. He smiled at messages and quickly locked the screen when I walked by. When I asked him who it was, he answered easily, too easily, as if he had rehearsed the response. Diana's visits increased. She let herself into our house even when I wasn't home. She knew the rhythm of our days, the codes, the spare keys. She belonged there, or so I thought. Once, after a particularly long day at the hospital, I came home early. I heard voices in the kitchen before I even took off my shoes. Lynn and Diana fell silent when they noticed me. There was a pause, brief but sharp, like a held breath. Diana laughed too loudly and hugged me, telling me how brave I was. Lynn kissed my forehead and asked if I had eaten. I felt something flicker in my chest, not suspicion exactly, more like confusion. I pushed it down.
My father's condition worsened quickly. His body weakened, his voice softened. There were days when he slept through my visits, and I sat beside him anyway, afraid to miss even a second. I talked to him about the baby, about how I hoped the child would inherit his gentleness. He squeezed my hand when he could, and when he could not, I held on tighter. At night, when I lay in bed next to Lynn, I stared at the ceiling and tried to quiet my mind. The baby kicked, a reminder that life was still moving forward even as another life was slipping away. Lynn slept facing away from me more often than not. I told myself that everything was fine. I had no idea that while I was memorizing the lines of my father's face, someone else was memorizing the lines of my life. I did not know that trust was being weaponized against me quietly and deliberately. And I certainly did not know that the foundation of my marriage was already cracking beneath my feet. But that was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, my life settled into a rhythm that felt both exhausting and unreal. Every morning began with the same quiet dread in my chest, the same careful preparation before I left the house. I packed lunches, kissed my children goodbye, and reminded myself to smile so they would not see how heavy my heart felt. Then I drove to the hospital where time seemed to stand still and rush forward all at once. My father's condition continued to decline. His skin grew thinner, almost translucent, and his once strong hands trembled when he tried to lift them. Some days he was lucid and joked softly, telling me stories from my childhood as if he were afraid they might disappear with him. Other days he drifted in and out of sleep, and I watched the rise and fall of his chest, terrified that one day it would stop. I spoke to him often about Lynn and the children. I told him how helpful Diana had been, how grateful I was for the support surrounding us. Each time I said her name, he smiled faintly. He trusted her because I trusted her. That realization would haunt me later. At home, things continued to feel subtly wrong. Lynn remained kind, attentive on the surface, but there was a distance between us that grew more pronounced with each passing day. He asked about my father, but rarely sat with me in my grief. When I cried, he held me, yet his arms felt more like a duty than a refuge. I noticed how often Diana was there when I returned from the hospital. She seemed to know my schedule intimately. If I came home earlier than expected, she was already leaving, keys in hand, offering a quick smile and a casual explanation about helping with the kids. If I came home late, Lynn mentioned that Diana had stopped by to check in. I told myself that this was what friendship looked like under pressure, that I was lucky to have someone willing to step into the gaps I could not fill. But unease has a way of demanding attention. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, I overheard Lynn speaking on the phone in the kitchen. His voice was low, almost intimate. He laughed softly at something the other person said. I froze, listening, my hand still clutching one of Mason's shirts. When I stepped into the doorway, Lynn startled. He ended the call abruptly and slipped his phone into his pocket. He smiled at me, but it did not reach his eyes. "Work?" I asked. "Yes," he replied without hesitation, "just checking in." The answer came too quickly, too smoothly. I nodded and turned away, my heart beating faster than it should have. That night, I lay awake long after Lynn fell asleep. The baby shifted inside me, and I rested my hand on my stomach, whispering promises of safety and love. I wondered if I was being unfair, if grief was making me suspicious of the man I had built a life with. I reminded myself that trust was the foundation of marriage, that doubt, once allowed in, could destroy everything. So I stayed silent. Days later, Diana invited herself to the hospital, bringing coffee and pastries. She sat beside me while my father slept, her voice gentle as she told me how strong I was, how proud she was of me. She squeezed my hand and said I was handling everything with such grace. Her touch lingered just a moment too long. I remember feeling a strange chill even though the room was warm. Later that afternoon, while Diana watched my father so I could step out, I walked down the hallway and leaned against the wall, suddenly overwhelmed. A nurse offered me a cup of water and asked if I was all right. I told her yes, because that was easier than explaining the storm inside me. When I returned, Diana was smiling at her phone. She tucked it away quickly when she noticed me. Something in me shifted. That night, after the children were asleep, I asked Lynn if everything was all right between us. I told him I felt disconnected, that I needed reassurance. He sighed, rubbing his temples, and told me he was under a lot of pressure, that work had been overwhelming, that he was trying to be strong for everyone. "I just need you to trust me," he said. Those words settled heavily in my chest. Trust. I wanted to give it freely. I had given it for 12 years, but doubt, once awakened, does not sleep easily. I began noticing patterns I could no longer ignore. Lynn's late nights coincided too often with Diana's visits. His mood lifted after she left. His phone never left his side. He took it into the bathroom. He angled it away from me in bed. One afternoon, I came home unexpectedly early from the hospital because my father had fallen into a deep sleep and the doctor assured me he was stable for the moment. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Diana's car parked in front of our house. My stomach dropped. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. I heard muffled voices upstairs. My heart pounded as I climbed the steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the hallway, the voices stopped abruptly. Diana emerged from the guest room, smoothing her hair, smiling brightly. "Oh, I did not know you would be home so soon," she said. Lynn appeared behind her moments later, his face flushed. They both spoke at once, offering explanations that blurred together. I nodded, forcing a smile, telling myself that I was imagining things, that grief was distorting my perception. But that night, as I lay beside Lynn, staring into the darkness, a single thought refused to leave my mind. What if I was wrong about everything? The next day, my father woke briefly and asked me to lean closer. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. "Tracy," he said softly, "do not ignore your instincts." I froze. He smiled faintly, squeezing my hand. "You have always known more than you think." I did not know how much those words would matter. As the days passed, my unease grew into something sharper. I started paying attention, really paying attention. I noted times, expressions, the way conversations shifted when I entered a room. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home.
Still, I said nothing. I was pregnant. I was grieving. I was trying to hold my family together while my father was slipping away. Confrontation felt impossible. I told myself I would wait, that clarity would come when I had the strength to face it. What I did not realize was that the truth was already pressing against the surface, ready to break through in the most devastating way. I thought silence was protecting me. I believed that patience would keep my world intact, but silence was only giving them more room to hide. And very soon, a single moment would force me to see what I had been avoiding all along. There is a quiet line between suspicion and certainty. I crossed it without realizing it, one small moment at a time, until there was no turning back. After my father spoke those words to me, telling me not to ignore my instincts, I carried them with me everywhere. They echoed in my mind while I drove to the hospital, while I sat beside his bed, while I lay awake at night listening to Lynn's breathing. I began to understand that my unease was not imagined. It was not grief alone. It was awareness awakening. I started to notice how Lynn watched the clock when I prepared to leave for the hospital, his relief when I said Diana would help with the kids. The way Diana seemed to know details she should not have known, like what Lynn had cooked for dinner or what time he planned to be home. Once, Diana mentioned a movie Lynn liked, one I had never seen with him. When I asked him about it later, he brushed it off, saying he must have mentioned it in passing. His eyes did not meet mine. I began documenting things quietly, not out of malice, but out of a growing need to ground myself in reality. Dates, times, small inconsistencies. I told myself that if nothing was wrong, I would feel foolish later, but if something was wrong, I would need clarity. At the hospital, my father's condition worsened rapidly. The doctors spoke to me privately, explaining that we were nearing the end. I held myself together in front of him, but when I stepped into the hallway, I broke down. Diana arrived shortly after, wrapping her arms around me, telling me she was there for anything I needed. Her phone buzzed in her hand while she held me. She glanced down, smiled briefly, then tucked it away. That night, Lynn did not come to the hospital. He said he was exhausted, that he needed rest so he could help the next day. Diana offered to drive me home instead. The car ride was quiet, heavy with things unsaid. When we reached my house, Diana lingered in the driveway, telling me again how strong I was. She hugged me tightly, her cheek brushing mine. Something about it felt wrong. Inside, Lynn was already asleep. His phone lay on the nightstand, face down. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it. I had never gone through his phone before. The idea felt like a violation, but another thought followed immediately, louder and more urgent. What if this is the only way I survive what is coming? I did not touch the phone that night. Fear stopped me. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being right. The next day, my father slipped into a semi-conscious state. He did not wake when I spoke to him. I held his hand and cried silently, my tears falling onto the hospital sheets. I told him everything I had yet not said, that I loved him, that I was scared, that I did not know how to do this without him. Lynn arrived later that afternoon, apologetic, bringing flowers. He kissed my cheek and asked how my father was. His concern felt practiced. Diana arrived soon after, carrying coffee, her presence almost automatic. The three of us stood together at my father's bedside, and for the first time I saw us clearly. I saw the triangle. I saw the imbalance. I saw how Lynn and Diana exchanged glances when they thought I was not looking. I felt suddenly very calm. That evening, after Diana left and Lynn went to shower, I picked up his phone. My hands were steady. I told myself that I was allowed to know the truth of my own life. The phone unlocked easily. I had known his passcode for years. Nothing had changed there. What I found inside changed everything. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then I opened his messages. Diana's name sat at the top. My breath caught. The last message was recent, casual, familiar, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with friendship. My vision blurred as I scrolled. The messages stretched back weeks, then months. Plans, jokes, complaints about stress, compliments that made my stomach turn, references to moments when I was not home, when I was at the hospital, while I was grieving. There were photos. I will not describe them. It is enough to say that there was no room for doubt left. My hands began to shake. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure Lynn would hear it through the bathroom door. I locked the phone and placed it back exactly where it had been. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. I did not scream. I did not cry. Not yet. I felt hollow.
When Lynn emerged from the bathroom, he smiled at me, completely unaware that the world he thought he controlled had just collapsed. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I am just tired." That night, I lay beside him, my body rigid, my mind racing. The baby moved inside me, and I pressed my hand to my stomach, grounding myself. I understood then that my life was divided into before and after. I also understood something else. I could not confront him yet. Not while my father was dying, not while my children slept peacefully down the hall, not while I was carrying a child who depended on me to be strong. Instead, I made a decision that would change the course of everything. I would be silent, but I would not be blind. Knowing the truth did not bring relief, it brought clarity, and clarity demanded action. I began planning in the shadows, preparing for a reckoning they never saw coming. And what I uncovered next would make the betrayal even more unforgivable. Once you see the truth, you can never unsee it. The days after my discovery felt unreal, as if I were moving through someone else's life, performing my role while my mind worked furiously behind the scenes. I woke each morning beside Lynn, listening to him breathe, wondering how someone could lie so easily while sharing a bed with the woman he had vowed to protect. I kissed my children goodbye, smiling through a pain that felt almost physical. I went to the hospital and sat beside my father, holding his hand, whispering reassurances I desperately needed myself. No one knew. Not yet. I became an actress in my own home, measured and careful. I did not change my routines. I did not confront. I did not cry in front of Lynn or Diana. Instead, I watched. I listened. I learned. I began taking screenshots when I could safely access Lynn's phone. I photographed messages, saved timestamps, documented patterns. I kept everything hidden in a secure folder, backed up to an account Lynn did not know existed. Each piece of evidence felt like a small shield, protecting me from being gaslit later. Diana continued to play the role of devoted friend. She brought meals, offered to watch the children, and told me repeatedly how strong I was. Each word felt like poison. I wondered how long she had been lying to my face, how long she had been looking into my eyes while betraying me behind my back. The worst part was how often the affair intersected with my father's illness. Messages sent while I sat in the hospital room, plans made during times Lynn knew I would not be home, intimacy scheduled around my grief. That realization hardened something inside me. I contacted a lawyer quietly during my lunch break at the hospital cafeteria. My voice trembled as I explained the situation, but the lawyer's calm professionalism steadied me. She told me what I needed to do, how to protect myself, how to document everything. She also reminded me of something critical. Because my father's health was failing, I needed to protect any inheritance or assets that might come to me. Anything mingled with marital property could become vulnerable.
That night, I cried alone in the shower, the sound of running water masking my sobs. I grieved my marriage. I grieved my friendship. I grieved the future I thought I had. At the hospital, my father grew weaker. One evening, he woke briefly and asked me to promise him something. "Promise me you will choose yourself," he whispered. I pressed my forehead to his hand and promised. Diana texted me that night, asking if I needed anything. I stared at the message for a long time before replying with a simple thank you. My hands shook as I typed. I wondered if she felt any shame at all. Lynn began acting bolder, less cautious. He assumed my silence meant ignorance. He grew careless with his phone, confident in his control over the narrative of our marriage. I noticed how he spoke about Diana in front of me, testing boundaries, watching my reaction. I gave him nothing. Inside, I was steel. I began preparing quietly. I gathered important documents, birth certificates, financial records, insurance policies. I packed an emergency bag for myself and the children, hiding it where Lynn would never look. All the while, I was pregnant. My body ached. My emotions surged unpredictably. At night, I spoke softly to the baby, telling them that I would protect them at all costs. My father entered hospice care. The room grew quieter, the machines fewer. I slept in a chair beside him, afraid to leave for any moment would mean losing him forever. Lynn was not there when it happened. Diana was. She sat across the room while I held my father's hand and whispered to him that it was all right to rest, that I loved him, that I would be okay, even though I did not believe it. When his breathing stopped, the silence was unbearable. I pressed my forehead to his chest and sobbed, my entire body shaking. Diana wrapped her arms around me as the nurse came in. She cried softly, murmuring words of comfort. I clung to her because I didn't know what else to do. Later, I learned that Lynn had been with her earlier that same day. That knowledge would come back to me like a blade. The days after my father's death felt unreal, as if I were moving through someone else's life, performing my role while my mind worked furiously behind the scenes. I woke each morning beside Lynn, listening to him breathe, wondering how someone could lie so easily while sharing a bed with the woman he had vowed to protect. I kissed my children goodbye, smiling through a pain that felt almost physical. I went to the hospital and sat beside my father, holding his hand, whispering reassurances I desperately needed myself. No one knew. Not yet. I became an actress in my own home, measured and careful. I did not change my routines. I did not confront. I did not cry in front of Lynn or Diana. Instead, I watched. I listened. I learned. I began taking screenshots when I could safely access Lynn's phone. I photographed messages, saved timestamps, documented patterns. I kept everything hidden in a secure folder, backed up to an account Lynn did not know existed. Each piece of evidence felt like a small shield, protecting me from being gaslit later. Diana continued to play the role of devoted friend. She brought meals, offered to watch the children, and told me repeatedly how strong I was. Each word felt like poison. I wondered how long she had been lying to my face, how long she had been looking into my eyes while betraying me behind my back. The worst part was how often the affair intersected with my father's illness. Messages sent while I sat in the hospital room, plans made during times Lynn knew I would not be home, intimacy scheduled around my grief. That realization hardened something inside me. I contacted a lawyer quietly during my lunch break at the hospital cafeteria. My voice trembled as I explained the situation, but the lawyer's calm professionalism steadied me. She told me what I needed to do, how to protect myself, how to document everything. She also reminded me of something critical. Because my father's health was failing, I needed to protect any inheritance or assets that might come to me. Anything mingled with marital property could become vulnerable. That night, I cried alone in the shower, the sound of running water masking my sobs. I grieved my marriage. I grieved my friendship. I grieved the future I thought I had. At the hospital, my father grew weaker. One evening, he woke briefly and asked me to promise him something. "Promise me you will choose yourself," he whispered. I pressed my forehead to his hand and promised. Diana texted me that night, asking if I needed anything. I stared at the message for a long time before replying with a simple thank you. My hands shook as I typed. I wondered if she felt any shame at all. Lynn began acting bolder, less cautious. He assumed my silence meant ignorance. He grew careless with his phone, confident in his control over the narrative of our marriage. I noticed how he spoke about Diana in front of me, testing boundaries, watching my reaction. I gave him nothing. Inside, I was steel. I began preparing quietly. I gathered important documents, birth certificates, financial records, insurance policies. I packed an emergency bag for myself and the children, hiding it where Lynn would never look. All the while, I was pregnant. My body ached. My emotions surged unpredictably. At night, I spoke softly to the baby, telling them that I would protect them at all costs. My father entered hospice care. The room grew quieter, the machines fewer. I slept in a chair beside him, afraid to leave for any moment would mean losing him forever. Lynn was not there when it happened. Diana was. She sat across the room while I held my father's hand and whispered to him that it was all right to rest, that I loved him, that I would be okay, even though I did not believe. That was the moment something inside me broke completely. They were not just betraying me, they were counting on my grief to hide it. I contacted my lawyer the next morning and told her everything. I asked her how quickly we could move if necessary. She reminded me to stay patient, to let them continue believing they were in control. Diana sent me a message that afternoon telling me she loved me and that my father would be so proud of the woman I had become. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. Thank you. 2 words, all the strength I could spare. My pregnancy advanced, my body heavy and sore. I attended therapy sessions quietly, learning how to ground myself when the anger threatened to overwhelm me. I learned that rage could be sharpened into resolve. One night, unable to sleep, I reviewed the evidence I had gathered, messages, photos, dates that aligned too perfectly with my hospital visits. There was more than enough to expose them publicly, to destroy the careful image they maintained. I realized then that I was no longer afraid of the truth. I was waiting for the right moment to unleash it. I thought the worst had already happened. I believed nothing could hurt more than losing my father while carrying this secret. But the next discovery would prove me wrong, because I was about to learn just how far their betrayal truly went. Grief has a way of sharpening your awareness. After my father's death, I moved through the world with a clarity that felt almost brutal. The fog that had surrounded me for months began to lift, replaced by a quiet determination to understand exactly what had been done to me. I stopped assuming the affair was only emotional or impulsive. I began to ask myself harder questions. How long had this really been going on? How deeply had my life been entangled in their deception? The answer came when I found an envelope I did not recognize. It was tucked inside a stack of mail Lynn had left on the kitchen counter. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A bank logo, a return address I vaguely recognized. Something told me to open it. Inside were statements for an account I did not know existed. My hands trembled as I read through them. The account had been opened months earlier. Transfers had been made regularly, small amounts at first, then larger ones. Money from our joint savings. Money I had assumed was being set aside for our children. For the baby. I took the papers into the bedroom and locked the door. My heart raced as I cross-referenced dates.
Transfers aligned with nights Lynn claimed to be working late. With weekends, he said he needed space to think. There were notes in the margins, short, careless messages. For us. Future clans. The room felt like it was spinning. This was not an affair born of momentary weakness. This was planning. That night, I waited until Lynn was asleep before checking his email. I felt no guilt. Any moral hesitation I once had was gone. What I found there confirmed my worst fears. There were emails between Lynn and Diana discussing apartments, neighborhoods, schools, timing. Timing. They spoke about waiting until after my father passed. They spoke about my pregnancy as an inconvenience. They spoke about my emotional state as something to manage until they were ready to move on. I sat on the floor and cried for the first time since discovering the affair. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent tears sliding down my face as the weight of their cruelty settled fully into my bones. In that moment, something shifted permanently inside me. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. I brought everything: the bank statements, the emails, the messages. She reviewed them carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. "You have a very strong case, and you need to act before he has a chance to move more assets." Together, we created a timeline, a strategy, steps to protect myself and my children, emergency custody plans, financial safeguards, everything I had once hoped I would never need. I opened a separate account in my name only. I secured my father's inheritance the moment it became available, following my lawyer's instructions precisely. I ensured nothing could be touched without my consent. At home, I remained calm, pleasant, unassuming. Diana continued to visit, increasingly bold. She spoke about future vacations, about how the kids adored her, about how lucky I was to have such a supportive circle. Each word fueled my resolve. Lynn grew careless. He no longer hid his phone consistently. He underestimated me completely. He had decided who I was in his story: weak, distracted, broken. He was wrong. One afternoon, while Lynn was at work, Diana stopped by unexpectedly. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes searching my face. "You seem different lately. Are you okay?" I smiled softly. "I am learning how to survive," I replied. She laughed, uncomfortable. "I'm glad we have you." So was I, because they were giving me everything I needed. With the truth fully exposed and my plans set in motion, I knew the end was approaching. I just had to decide how much of the truth the world would see when it finally arrived. Once my plans were in place, I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. Not peace, not relief, but clarity. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I knew I would not hesitate when the moment came. I chose the timing carefully. My father had been laid to rest, my finances were protected, my lawyer was prepared, my children were safe, their routines stable, unaware of the storm about to break. I waited until my body felt strong enough to carry me through what was coming, my pregnancy far enough along that I trusted myself to endure the emotional strain. Lynn and Diana, meanwhile, grew increasingly careless. They had begun talking openly about the future they imagined together. Diana spoke once about how exciting it would be to start fresh. Lynn mentioned needing space, hinting at a possible separation, framing it as concern for my emotional well-being. I listened. I smiled. I planned. I decided the truth would come out in the one place they believed was safest: a family gathering. Lynn's parents were hosting a small dinner to mark what they believed would be a moment of healing after my father's passing. They invited close relatives. Diana was included, of course, because she had positioned herself as my constant support. I agreed eagerly. On the day of the gathering, I dressed carefully, not dramatically, not mournfully. I chose something simple and elegant, my pregnancy visible, undeniable, a reminder of everything Lynn had risked and dismissed.
Before we left, I made copies of everything. Evidence neatly organized, screenshots, statements, emails. I placed them in my bag alongside my phone, fully charged. At dinner, the atmosphere was warm. Laughter filled the room. People spoke about memories of my father, offering condolences and praise for my strength. Lynn played his role perfectly, attentive and charming. Diana sat across from me, her hand occasionally brushing Lynn's arm. I waited. After dessert, when everyone was settled, I stood. "I would like to say something," I said calmly. The room quieted. I thanked everyone for their support during the hardest months of my life. I spoke about grief, about resilience, about the importance of honesty and family. Then I changed the music. I connected my phone to the television. The first screenshot appeared. Silence fell like a physical force. Diana's smile froze. Lynn stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Tracy, stop," he said. I did not. I played the slideshow I had prepared. Messages, dates, bank transfers, emails outlining plans that did not include me or my children. Conversations mocking my grief and exploiting my absence. Gasps filled the room. Lynn's mother covered her mouth. His father stared at the screen in disbelief. Diana began to cry, insisting it was not what it looked like. Lynn tried to explain, to minimize, to redirect blame. I stood silently, letting the evidence speak. When the slideshow ended, I turned to them. "This is the truth of my marriage," I said. "This is the truth of my friendship." I looked at Diana. "You betrayed me while my father was dying," I said. "You betrayed my children. You betrayed everything we were." I looked at Lynn. "You used my grief as cover." I said, "You planned a future that erased me." There was nothing left to say. I walked out. Outside, the night air felt sharp and clean. I sat in my car and breathed, one hand resting on my stomach, grounding myself in the present. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls, messages, apologies, accusations. I did not answer. I went home, packed the rest of what I needed, and took my children to a place of safety. The marriage was over. I thought exposure would bring closure. I believed the worst was behind me. I did not yet know how deeply the fallout would ripple through every part of our lives. The days after the exposure felt eerily quiet, not peaceful, but still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had expected chaos, screaming, endless confrontation. Instead, what arrived first was clarity. Lynn moved out within the week. His parents insisted he take responsibility for his actions and made it clear that what he had done was indefensible. They reached out to me privately, apologizing for the pain I had endured, assuring me that I and the children would always be family to them. Their support did not erase the damage, but it reminded me that not everyone chooses betrayal when faced with difficulty. Diana disappeared from my life entirely. After the dinner, she sent a long message filled with apologies that centered mostly on herself. I did not respond. There was nothing left to say. Some bonds, once broken, do not deserve repair. The divorce proceedings moved forward quickly, guided by the careful preparation I had done in silence. The evidence spoke clearly. Custody arrangements prioritized stability for Mason and Sophia. Financial protections ensured that my children would not pay the price for Lynn's choices. His plans unraveled just as methodically as he had once believed them secure. Throughout it all, I focused on my children. Mason asked hard questions. Sophia clung to me at night. I answered honestly, gently, without burdening them with details they did not need. I told them that sometimes adults make choices that hurt people and that it was not their fault. I promised them that they were loved, safe, and never alone. Then my due date arrived. I gave birth surrounded by quiet strength rather than false promises. As I held my newborn in my arms, I felt a profound sense of beginning. Life had continued, even when I thought it might stop. I named the baby with intention, choosing a name that meant resilience. In the months that followed, I rebuilt slowly. Therapy helped me untangle grief from anger. I learned that forgiveness was not something I owed anyone, but something I could one day choose for myself. I learned that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, simply saying, "I will survive." Lynn attempted reconciliation more than once. He apologized, he blamed stress, he blamed poor judgment. I listened once, then set boundaries that did not waver. The marriage was over. The future he had imagined no longer included me. Diana never returned. I found comfort in small things: morning routines with my children, walks where the air felt lighter, moments of laughter that surprised me with their ease. I began to recognize myself again, not as someone defined by betrayal, but as someone shaped by endurance. I often thought of my father during that time, of his quiet wisdom, of the way he had told me not to ignore my instincts. I carried his lessons forward, honoring him by choosing honesty, courage, and self-respect. This story is not about revenge, even though exposure played a role. It is about reclaiming agency. It is about refusing to disappear in the face of cruelty. It is about choosing truth when silence would have been easier. If you are listening to this and standing at the edge of your own realization, know this: you are not weak for trusting, you are not foolish for loving deeply, and you are not broken beyond repair. I am Tracy McCormick. I survived the ultimate double betrayal while carrying life and saying goodbye to someone I loved more than words can hold. I rebuilt myself from the ground up, and I am still standing. If this story moved you, if Tracy's journey resonated with something you have lived through or are still surviving, I invite you to pause for a moment and breathe. You are not alone here. If you have not already, please take a second to like this video. It helps these stories reach others who may need to hear them right now. If you want more real-life stories of betrayal, resilience, and women finding their strength in the darkest moments, subscribe to Voices of Kaitlyn Grit and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And if you feel safe doing so, share your thoughts or your own story in the comments. This channel is not just about storytelling, it is about connection, validation, and healing. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself, and remember, you are stronger than you think.